three of my panelists have been researching and investigating corruption, human rights violations, and protest movements in Iran for many, many years. All three started their work in Iran, and as a result of their work, they can't return to Iran. And all three of them are closely connected to activist networks in Iran right now. That's why I'm particularly excited to introduce them to you. I'm going to start with this man, Jiyar. He's a Kurdish Iranian investigative journalist and filmmaker. He's reported from inside Iran as well as extensively in the region. He's known for his frontline work in Iraq during the war against ISIS and his hard-hitting investigations exposing Iranian state corruption, assassinations, and interventions in the region. His documentary, Iran Women Rising, was broadcast on the BBC last year, and his most recent documentary, which will be broadcast on both BBC Persian and the BBC, is about Minu Majidi, a 62-year-old mother who was killed by security forces while protesting on the streets of Kermanshah in the west of Iran, which I can't wait to see. Then we have a dear friend of mine, Negin Shiraghaei, who's a human rights activist. Now, Negin started her career as a journalist, first working for Iranian news outlets, including Iran's top newspapers, Shahri and Shah, and then going on to work for BBC Persian, where she became one of its main news anchors. That position made her and her family a target for the Islamic regime. She's now the founder of Azadeh Network, a non-partisan group of Iranians in the diaspora committed to amplifying the voices of Iranians in Iran. As a human rights champion, Negin has brought her cause to a global audience, twice speaking before the UN Human Rights Council. Recently, I nearly forgot this, recently she's investigated crimes committed by the IRGC, Iran's Revolutionary Guard, and she's got a Persian language podcast called Kutena, where she exposes Iranian regime corruption. For any Persian language speakers here, it's a brilliant podcast. You'll be hooked. Finally, but not least, Azadeh Purzand is a human rights researcher focusing on grassroots civil society and human rights in Iran. She's a senior fellow and head of the State Society Relations Research Unit at the Center for Middle East and Global Order. She's previously served as the editor-in-chief of the Women's Policy Journal of Harvard, and she's co-authored book chapters on women's rights and rule of law in Iran. She's the daughter of two Iranian former prisoners of conscience, and is the co-founder and the executive director of the Siamak Purzand Foundation, named after her late father, and dedicated to the promotion of freedom of expression. She's currently a PhD candidate at SOAS University.
Just before you start your question, I just want to say we can't go back to Iran. This we cannot leave.
That's a fair point.
Also, there's
Good point. You're right,
free
actually.
accommodation in Evin.
I think they would roll out the red carpet for you. I think they very much want you to all go back. I'm going to kick off proceedings with a very quick recap of a few uprising facts and figures, just for a little bit of context. So we all know that these uprisings have been the most significant and widespread since the birth of the Islamic regime, since the 1979 revolution. There have been protests in every single one of Iran's provinces. We know that 7 protesters have been executed by the state. We know that over 500 protesters have been killed, and human rights groups estimate that between 20 to 60,000 Iranians have been arrested and imprisoned at some point. I want to start by getting an update from each of you about what's really happening on the ground right now. Negin, I'm going to start with you. From the outside, it very much looks like the protests have been crushed by the regime. Is this the case, and what's happening right now?
Thank you for the lovely introduction, the energy you're bringing to the room, Ramita. So the short answer is no. So there's still a resistance. It's on the ground in different shapes and forms. One of the major things, so I've been talking to one of the activists that just left Iran 2 weeks ago. It depends who you are and where you are working. So if you're a prominent activist, you're most probably under the surveillance 24/7. They kind of track you down, try to find out where you go, who you talk to. So those kind of people try to refrain from creating networks or talking to their friends because of the security risk. But this movement has a massive difference from the other ones up to date. And that is that you have a lot of people, ordinary people, who had nothing to do with politics up to date. And with Gina Massa's death, they realized that they need to take action and change their situation. And that created a lot of underground movements, as well as a linked different protests that was happening in Iran together. So this activist that, she's really famous, prominent feminist activist, I'm not gonna name her, but she was saying, you have to look at the protests, for example, when the pensioners are going to the streets right now. It's the continuity of the protest of women, life, freedom. Even though if they're not gonna shout that slogan at their protest, they still are really linked to that. And her experience was that she has spent for 2 months in prison. She was arrested right after the first protest in Tehran, and spent 2 months in prison. She was saying, like, I was in prison before, 4 years before that, and the women who were back then in the prison, they were like either political activists or criminals. This time, there were 5 times the amount of people, women in Evin prison, in the corridors that she was held. But they were all ordinary women. We had 18, she was saying, like, we had 18 years old to someone more than 65 years old who was walking with the walker and was arrested. And they were all saying, we are ordinary women, but we know we have to change the situation. Why this happened, and this is a moment that everyone realized we're not going to go back, and this situation needs to change from, structurally. So, and then the things that they were talking about, for example, women's rights, pensions for, housewives, the right to have divorce. It's aiming the patriarchal system, as well as the corruption, the amount of corruption in Iran, unified other groups around the rights for women as well, and then that's why we see a lot of oppression in the last 2 months.
What are the pensioners doing on the
So
streets?
basically, for the ones who don't know what's happening, the economic situation in Iran is dire. So the inflation rate is going high almost every other month. The price for meat and essential food in Iran is rapidly went up, and a lot of people are facing dire situation in terms of that. And the pensioners, and the government itself is bankrupt, so they cannot pay the pensioners and the government officials, employees. And the pensioners' problem has been going on for some time now. But it's really interesting to see the pensioners are actually really active on the streets when Gina died, and then the protests that came after that. And they continue doing those protests as a kind of a not giving up, keeping that small fire in their heart to say, okay, I'm still doing something, I'm going to the streets, even though the protest is not as much as before.
So there are still small protests happening.
Yeah, for different reasons.
Negin, can you tell me about the protesters who have been injured? Because I remember you were researching this a while ago why it was happening, because there was very specific injuries that are happening.
Yeah.
And actually when I spoke about it with friends and colleagues, they were quite surprised because it really hasn't been reported very widely.
One of the patterns that came out of this process, and maybe Azadeh can contribute to that much better, is that instead of just shooting to kill, which they've done in 2019, November 2019, this time they realized it's not as easy as that. The international pressure is going to rise, or for some other reason, disobedience inside their own structures and other reasons, led them to use other means. For example, shooting directly to the eyes of people. And a lot of women and men lost their eyes during the process and during the last. There is a wonderful report by Iran Wire in English. If anyone is interested, if you search that, you see a lot of testimonies. As well as there are so many reports, and there are some people here in the audience as well. One person that is involved in one of the campaigns we're doing is that they're shooting at the genitals, both men and women, targeting permanent damage to the people. And it's really, and these are coming from the doctors inside Iran as well. It shows the change in the pattern and the mindset, a strategy of, okay, I'm going to harm you for life, And there are so many testimonies of people saying, they said, I'm going to shoot you right now, so you're not going to continue protest, and they should.
And we're going to move on to the strategy of the regime in dealing with protesters later. Quickly, I want to ask you about the morality piece, Negin, because there's been so much misreporting coming from Iran, and one issue has been the morality piece. In fact, recently I heard on, it was BBC Radio 4, the Today programme, one of the presenters was talking about how there was talk of the morality police being disbanded, which is not true. Can you set the record straight and what is happening with the morality police right now?
It's not only, I'll be quick, it's not only didn't vanish, it actually rounded up. They're doing it much more viciously, as well as there are bills, there's a bill going on being enforced which raised the amount of fee that you have to pay if you're not wearing hijab. And they confiscate your car, and there's a lot of financial burdens if you're not wearing a hijab and obeying the mandatory law.
Oh, that was quick.
I'm taking the laughing space here, so I'm going to be a bit more quiet now.
Thank you. Azadeh, can we come to you? Azadeh, can you tell me what has happened to these tens of thousands of protesters who have been arrested and imprisoned?
Yeah, sure. First of all, thank you for this important event and also being here on this very esteemed audience. Many of you are experts on the subject yourself, have covered it, so look forward to the exchange. And also just to honor all of those individuals who lost their lives, eyes, who are in prison today. I'm sure they would do a much better job than I would sitting here. I kept thinking of them, walking today towards this wonderful club. Maybe one day. So yes, I think, as Negin mentioned, just as the scale of this uprising has been absolutely unprecedented in post-revolutionary Iran, while the patterns of state human rights violations, of abuse, have been more or less sort of in character with the brutal regime that the Islamic Republic is, of course the scale is also to a degree that has been extremely difficult for those of us who try to document and research, to sort of collect raw information, make sense of it in a way that would be usable in a court of law one day. In terms of what happened to them, I think broadly speaking, it's not only detention, it's torture, whether it's so-called white torture or physical torture, psychological, solitary confinement, overcrowded prisons, families not having any news from their loved ones for days, weeks, sometimes months, medical negligence in prisons, clandestine prisons, various kinds of almost random temporary detention centers that they would come up with, and very disoriented, scared, confused family members looking after their loved ones. On top of that, recently Amnesty International also did a report on the amount of pressure on the families of those detained, which you name it. It's anything from the siblings and the mothers and the fathers of these individuals being under heavy surveillance, to detained, the regime threatening these families that if you speak up, will arrest your other, child, and any technique that you can imagine to sort of make sure that they don't speak up. Those of them who have spoken up, many of them are also right now prisoners. But I also, want to, one more thing before I go to another point is that we also have heard and have managed to document gender-based violence in prison. So sexual harassment of different degrees is a serious issue. Jiyar will tell you that in some of the prisons and detention centers that are away from the center, even more horrific things happens. We've had a number of protest-related executions, many non-protest-related executions that we believe were sort of fast-forwarded in order to instill intimidation for prevention of further escalation of the uprisings. But I also really here want to, I think maybe it's hard to understand for us as Western audiences what detention really means, detention, I think, is different categories when we're talking about a country like Iran. There were many people who were detained and maybe rather quickly let out on heavy bails. But you're also sort of a hostage to the regime, and so is your family. It doesn't necessarily mean that if you're outside of prison, you are not counted as a detainee, as a hostage to the prison authorities. And I think this is very important and I think this is why they went for thousands and thousands of individual detained, because they wanted to sort of, prevent more and more people coming to the street. And another thing is actually a lot of the activists or people who had shown a potential for leadership at a grassroots level, whether as women's rights activists or others, were preemptively arrested, and sometimes now still are preemptively arrested from their homes, not from the street, just so that the movement doesn't find its various leaders who can freely lead their communities. I leave it at that.
In the last couple of weeks, there's been a crackdown, hasn't there, on activists throughout the country. Can you tell me about this and what's happening right now?
Yes, I mean, as expected, there has been another wave of arrests, very much focused on activists. I would say, for example, women's rights activists. It's kind of sad, but I can't really name any who's outside of jail or who is, again, that kind of detention that I'm talking about, sort of one leg in, one leg out. They have a list of individuals, like I said, that they kind of arrest and re-arrest, and so many people who, from their perspective, should be in jail, not to make noise, are in jail. The mothers, I would say the justice-seeking mothers of those who were killed, sadly we're not hearing from some of the more vocal ones because we don't know where they are, or we know where they are, but they are behind bars. So I think they have a sort of a mapping system of who has personally, I think they go for specifically for leadership abilities in preempting these kinds of anniversaries, and this one in particular. And I think we'll see more this week because, for example, at the graveside of Master Jina Amini, there will be a gathering, and we'll have to see what will happen, and many of us unfortunately know what will happen, but still the people will continue.
To what extent is this still a women-led uprising?
I think, I don't know, maybe my perspective here is a little different from Negin. I actually don't think this uprising began with the death in custody of our beloved Master Jina Amini. I think that this was a climactic moment, absolutely historic, of an ongoing 45 years or so. Even you can go back to the constitutional revolution, really. Movement, in my opinion, absolutely led by women. But then the thing is, women, time and again, they would try to sort of reach some kind of a political success towards freedom, and then they're sidelined after that. So, in my opinion, Iranian women did not wake up to their rights on the day that Jina was killed. And they did not stop either. And the Islamic Republic has, I think, one really big threat, and that's women. And they actually have made this threat in a way themselves by politicizing a woman's body, a woman's ordinary life so much so that now in a way it's a peaceful weapon, in my opinion, in women's hands in order to continue the plight.
I'm going to add one, I agree with you that there's a history behind it, but I'm going to add one thing, and that is that throughout this year, we've seen women continuously resisting. They were really brave, going out on the streets without wearing hijab and defying the government. And it happened on every single level. It's from the old person, 80 years old, going on the streets without a hijab, to the head of a startup, like one of the biggest startups is in Iran. She's a top manager, and she didn't wear a hijab, and then she had to leave the country recently. So I think that's a really good indicator that is still, this is a women-led revolution, and it's gonna continue to be led by women.
Jiyar, in the last few months, you've been meeting protesters who've managed to cross the border and flee Iran. What have you learned?
I think in the past, I would say, from the first days actually of the uprising, many people really escaped. Simply they needed medical attention because they were afraid to go to hospital. As Negin and Azadeh said, many of them were targeted in their eyes, and some of them were arrested in the hospital. Some of them they left simply because security forces thought they were dead. But miraculously they survived and crossed the border. I went to Iraqi Kurdistan. Many of them escaped through the network of the Kurdish movement. They moved, go there. Some of them they went to Turkey. And actually, as we speak, I think what time is it now? One of our characters, Sima Waradbegi, who was shot almost at elbow, was completely emptied out. We went to Kurdistan. Actually, I think now about touching down in Munich airport. This group, she's going. Hopefully, they can reconstruct her arm. So many people came out. I think one story really stuck to me. I think I repeated this in another place, if some of the audiences comment with it a few days ago. I met this young mother. She recently escaped Sakaz, which is the hometown of Mahsa Jina. And she was right by the Jina's casket when she was buried, and she had this beautiful image of this woman giving a speech, because all of us who follow the story, who is this woman giving a speech to thousands of men on the cemetery and talking about this is the result of patriotic society, this is the result of the death of Jina and many Jinas is the result of this extremist version of religion. You have to talk about something you see. It's an extremely militarized region. The security forces, the informant are everywhere. So I saw for the first time her image. This young woman, she's a teacher, and giving this speech. And that lady told me from the moment Jina was buried, our fear was buried with her. And she told me who threw the headscarf first up, and then many followed. And I think that's the story you hear from so many people. Yes, we don't have that kind of protest in the street we saw last year, but it seems to me is brewing beneath the surface. We see so many people going to the street, particularly women, defiantly, actually walking by the security forces, deliberately to just defy their authority. I think that's amazing. But one thing I want to say, at this moment we talk, we really have to give credit to the parents of Jina Mahsa. Her mother, last year it was her father who, despite all the pressure, he talked to us. He refused to be silenced. He defied and he called the government and security forces liar about their version of the event, what happened to his daughter in the custody. And now Mahsa's mother, Mujgan Iftikhari, in the past few weeks, she's been very vocal. Her brother just a few days ago was arrested to put pressure on her, but she's refusing to bow to them. And in Sakaz, as I talk to you, I was just coming, the footage I am receiving from the people on the ground, there are convoys of anti-riot police from neighboring provinces actually being deployed to the Kurdish region. And someone inside Mahsa's hometown said every corner there is a checkpoint. And they are planning, someone within the governor office was telling me, they are planning from Friday completely cordon off the entire city, so people from neighboring cities and neighboring provinces wouldn't be able to go there. I think the government is extremely worried. One of the reasons arresting people ahead of the anniversary is they know the potential of that region. Just on Sunday night, they stormed to this environmental group, the Chiites, and Juman Sabzi Chia. They are completely, absolutely peaceful. They are a group of women and men. They go clean up the nature. If there is a fire, which most of the time set by the security forces because they want to clear the vision, they go to extinguish the fire, put the fire off. Many of them died during doing this. They stormed in their meeting. Tens of them were arrested. Their smartphone was confiscated. They released them the next day, but few of them are still in jail. And even today, Another activist in Mahsa's hometown was arrested, Hero Kadimi. He's a well-known, well-respected among the activists for human rights activity. And but anyways, what I'm saying is the government is very nervous. I think they are very nervous if this protest again, just like last year, spark and start, they may not be able to control it again.
Why are we not hearing news of this and of what's happening, and also news of the fact that Kurdistan, which you've been covering very closely, and you've been covering Baluchistan, were two provinces where the protests persisted when the protests had died down everywhere else in the country, yet there's so little information, and in fact so little footage about what's happening there on the ground.
I think actually in the English language, other than Persian, I think in the Persian language services there are numbers of television, they're really covering it extensively, including BBC. But I think I wanted to talk about why in those regions continues, why not in other places. I talked to actually Sina's husband, this girl, a woman, a young mother, I told her she escaped Bukhan because she lost her hand. Her husband told me he was in the bazaar. He had a story. He said for the first time, I knew my neighbor for 30 years never shut down his shop, but he did. Many people, many corner stores, they would tell each other, if you don't have the money, just come, take whatever you need, whenever you can afford, pay me back. That was a kind of sense in that region. And I think he said, I think even the security forces in that region were willing to leave. They knew their days are numbered. Yet he said, we were very surprised why we don't see this kind of mass gathering in Tehran, in Tabriz, in Shiraz. Those are cities where they can actually change things. Because if entire Kurdish region of Baluchistan completely rise up, even control it, even take the control of government, in my opinion, the regime will survive. The only places can make about change is the capital city or other major city. I think one reason why Baluchistan continued, because they had a leadership. It was the cleric who ironically supported Taliban a long time ago, but when he saw the movement started, he became very liberal. Many of us were following the news was, oh my gosh, that's very interesting. We saw the change even in him, and it shows how much Sistan Baluchistan is a very conservative region and one of the most impoverished region of Iran. And obviously, women always is the forefront of all, they carry this burden. I was very surprised the stance he took, and actually, defiantly, weeks after weeks, he came to the Friday prayer and actually challenged the government, challenged the leadership. We have never seen before something like this. And in Kurdish region also, why it continued while other places died out. I think the Kurdish political parties have a root there. They have been active for almost more than 75 years. In my opinion, in that region, it was their network, their underground network, organized those mass protests. I remember in the Kurdish city of Sanandaj, if the police were storming in one neighborhood, they were so organized, they would form the other neighborhood, come out. So they would make the police tired, crazy, and even in the evening, some of those young people would say, okay, let's go out to hunt police cars or set them on fire. So I think the reason that region continued, in my opinion, is because they have active political parties. It doesn't matter what opposition, what rival say, in my opinion, people listen to that.
Well, then wouldn't you say as well that partly Alice has been saying the reason the protest, the uprising was so widespread and lasted for so long in the rest of the country was precisely because it didn't have a leader.
Yeah.
Because when there is a leader, it's much easier to behead the movement because you execute the leader. So I guess maybe as well in places like Kurdistan and Baluchistan, people have less to lose.
Exactly. I think one of the main reasons many people went out, they don't have anything to lose. I mean, the economy is crippling. Even there is somebody was coming out from Tehran and said there is no middle class anymore. Many people were middle class right now. Most of them are below poverty line, and I think corruption and all those issues in Iran actually is is destroying anyone. You mentioned pensioners coming to the street. A while ago, people who defended Islamic Republic of Iran, they came out in front of the parliament. They were chanting a slogan in favor of Saddam Hussein because they said, "Oh, we made a mistake. We're fighting," and I said, "We keep you." In a way, they were saying,
Wow.
"You are worse than Saddam Hussein." These are the people who lost limb, who were by chemical weapon. They were affected. They fight for the regime to survive. And here we are, even the government cannot pay them.
Yeah. One thing I'd like to talk about are the changes that have happened as a result of these protests. So even though the protests seem to have died down for now, and of course we're waiting for them to perhaps engulf the country on the anniversary of Mahsa Amini's death, people talk about the fact that they say there's no turning back. Negin, what does that mean when people say there's no turning back, and what are the changes you think have happened?
In my view, the biggest change is in the perception of patriarchal system and then how it operates. It changed the people's mindset, and there is a shift in the culture. When I was talking about like women going out on the streets without hijab, even like 6 months before Jinnah, like a day before Jinnah's death, it was, you know, if Iran is one of those countries, as a woman, you don't feel safe on the streets. There's so much catcalling, there's sexual harassment on the streets. And it's like 20 times a day. You walk down the streets and you feel like, oh my God, I need to leave. And it's like, I've heard it from one of my friends who's a boy, and he was saying like, as a boy, I felt really, I would get, talked down by my friends if we were all standing on the street and a beautiful woman would pass by and I wouldn't catcall. Now, what you see on the street is completely opposite. I have a lot of, eyewitnesses talking about this, and a friend who went from UK back to Iran 3 months ago, talking about going to the south of Tehran, one of the most deprived part of Tehran, and the woman defying the government, walking down the street without hijab, and the men shying away from looking at them, just to give them enough space to bravely continue their defiance. And I think that's the massivest change we could have experienced. It's a shift in the culture that we were dreaming about it for years and centuries, like 150 years, to be able to reach there. As well as there is this solidarity that we see from men. Like for example, there are the funds that people created in their factories and firms to support the women who are arrested, or like their car is confiscated by the regime so they can pay for the taxi to get to work. And men are contributing. There are also this kind of conversations like housewives. There's so many Persian podcasts now that they, really ordinary people going to the housewives and talking to them and say like, what's your understanding of women life freedom? And that understanding is targeting the patriarchal system to the core of it. And I love seeing that, and I think that's why this movement is not going to go back, because that change has happened. Cultural change and revolution has happened.
I've got one question about women not wearing hijab, not covering up in Tehran. I don't know if you've seen the videos and photographs. It's quite extraordinary. The extent to which women aren't covering up, and there are even pictures of women in shorts, in skirts, showing their arms, wearing sexy clothes. Is this just in the rich, kind of uptown, North Tehran bits of the city?
Well, it's actually the opposite. So, my friend who went 3 months ago was saying in northern Tehran, they're usually using their car and they don't walk down the streets. And it's usually the people who have something to do with the regime. It's mostly to the rest of the Tehran that you see this kind of, and it's not only in Tehran. We've seen images from across the country in different parts of Iran, as well as like my mom is my example. Like she sends me pictures, especially from northern Iran. We live in northern Iran. I don't anymore, but so people her age, women her age, in small villages, they go around without hijab now.
So this isn't just confined to the capital. This is all across the country.
Yeah.
Azadeh, what about you? What are the changes you think have happened that are permanent, you hope are permanent?
I'm just going to use it to just sort of talk from a personal perspective, and it's been an emotional year, I think, for all of us. you know, who love Iran and Iranians and care about, you know, freedom in some form and shape. And as you said kindly in my bio, I come from a family of prisoners of conscience. You know, I grew up with intelligence service, parallel intelligence service, SUVs parked outside of our home. The first time I was interrogated, I think I was 9 years old. When I was 2 years old, the authorities took my father when he was alone at home with me. And so I was left alone screaming until the neighbors found me, and so on. But you know, growing up in Iran, while we had so many people in my schools and things like this, really sympathetic teachers and all of that, we were still really scary humans walking, you know. People often, especially in some eras of my childhood, you know, would, while they maybe, for example, express sympathies with us and the cause that my parents had picked, they would try to publicly distance themselves from us. Even until a few years ago when we were abroad during the whole JCPOA conversations, I would have you know, people at my house who would, you know, would be very scared to publicly affiliate with me in any form and shape. We were called Westerners, anti-religion, anti-Muslim, anti-Islam, all of these things. And you know, I like look back, I look at it like almost like a dead person. I look at what's happening in the streets, and I think, really, we were the Westerners, corrupt people, you know, corrupting your people. Look at, you know, I think to myself, like, all of your daughters are probably right now screaming, chanting out slogans that, you know, my kind of people would never dare to. You know, like, people like us who were just kind of, as a family, secular, looking for, you know, different little bits and pieces of freedom, we were actually trying to educate ourselves on Islamic law, on figuring out ways to make incremental change so that there will be like no bloodshed, so nobody goes to jail, hush hush, let's do what we can. They didn't welcome that. Not only they didn't welcome that, they tortured and they detained and they killed everybody who tried to, despite their actual belief, they tried to take on a more gradual sort of approach to reforming this system. And they got to where they got. So in my opinion, women like freedom, aside from the conversation on the women's leadership and the coalescence of the you know, highly persecuted minority groups, and women and youth on the street, it's about failure to contain a people. You know, it's about a simple story of an abuser who thinks that there will be never you know, a doomsday, and I think while we didn't you know, reach that sort of conventional outcome result in terms of a regime change as bluntly as it was being chanted out in the streets of the, you know, the country. I think this was the furthest, you know, that person who is under abuse ran away from home. And there will be a time where they will, you know, they will run away and they will succeed. So I think I see that as a, you know, there is in domestic violence, they say a woman who, you know, a woman who is under domestic violence runs away multiple times until there will be this one time. I think that we are closer than ever to that one time.
Jiyar, I'm particularly interested in your perspective when it comes to minorities and the Kurdish issue. Do you think these protests have had any long-lasting effects on Kurdish moves for independence?
I don't think none of the main Kurdish political parties really ever in their manifesto, they advocate independence, because I think if you talk, as a matter of fact, actually I interviewed all the main, and I just tonight the interview with the Purzand, which is the most armed fighters in the mountain at this moment, and one of the leaders, a female actually, and I interviewed with her. None of them advocate separation. I think most of the traditional Kurdish political parties are advocating a federal, secular, democratic Iran. Purzand, which is further a step away, they believe in confederation, a democratic society which have been in Rojava, in north of Turkey, in Syria, have been implementing. They have a 50-50 policies, 50% women and 50% men. Every single political parties, community leaders, commanders is a co-chair, 1 man and 1 woman. For example, if somebody marry off her daughter without the consent of the girl, he could be fine. They cannot have a second wife. I'm talking about a very traditional society they've been implementing. So none of the Kurdish political party actually have been advocating separation. The problem is, in the past 40 years, the Iranian government masterfully have been advocating and spreading this to tell the rest of the country, oh, their problem is not your problem. They want to separate. And even during this uprising, obviously, this is very obvious. Many women has been killed by the hand of Iranian regime. But the reason actually we had that kind of response, because in the Kurdish region, there is a common ground because of the language, the city is small. Possibly if you live in a small town here, you know everyone. But if you live in London, possibly you don't know who is your neighbor. But in a small town in the Kurdish community, that was a sense of solidarity. Entire city came out. When they came out, there was no fear. They could confront the security forces. And that footage went out to the rest of the country. If they can do it, we could do it too. So this is what regime has been actually. The Iranian government has been saying, oh, the Kurdish has been doing this, but the reality was, for the first time, it was last year, so many Iranians understood actually their problem is our problem, their cause is our cause. And that's why even when in the first or second weeks of uprising, the Revolutionary Guard, what they did, they went actually bombed and fired ballistic missile and short-range missile at the Kurdish bases. They really wanted to take the attention, what's happening inside the country, what's happening in universities, in high schools even. The girls were chanting against the regime. Take it outside of the border, say, oh, this is a group of political parties, Kurdish separatist parties, who are trying to divide our country. As we talk, actually, Iranian government have given an ultimatum to Iraq to kick out those Kurdish parties. I think is by the end of this week. And we may witness a war, because I think the government really, if you talk to the Kurdish leader, they want to shift attention to the border and say these people are fighting to separate the country. But the reality on the ground, I have interviewed many of them, and many of them I'm pretty sure Negin and Azadeh have come across. I don't think any of those political parties would have an agenda to separate. Although, in my opinion, every human being has a right to self-determine his own destiny. This is a democratic value. In Scotland, people wanted to separate. There's a referendum. In Canada and Quebec, we had it. So, but I don't think any of those political parties now and before had that agenda.
I'm going to add one sentence that actually there was an order from some of the political parties, the 2 main ones in Iran, to Kurdistan, because the younger generation were quite angry, especially like 6 months after, that we're not going to go down that road. Now it's time for unity and making sure that the message we are sending is about unity in Iran.
So actually, the protests have done the opposite, you're both saying.
Yeah.
That they kind of, in a way, they've acted as a unifier.
I just wanted one element. I think the Revolutionary Guard Intelligence Service and Ministry of Intelligence Service, they have an army of cyber soldiers. They are days and night are active. Whenever I put my report out, normally I go midnight, I know they are sleeping, but later I found out they get their overtime, so I publish this in the morning. I don't want them to benefit from my report, so they come on air. And then the reality is many of them are posing as a Kurd, as a monarchist, as different groups, and actually trying to divide. This is the reality, and unfortunately has been very effective.
Jiyar, I'm going to come to you for this next question, because the regime has managed to withstand these protests. And last year, I know some of you were at this talk last year, and 2 of our 3 panelists predicted that the regime would fall within a year. Jiyar was also on that panel, and you were the only panelist.
I said I'm going to buy you dinner, although you are a man. I'll take it with me. If it's happening, I'm willing to pay, but unfortunately no.
You were the only
and I
one
put the money aside, by the way.
who got it right. Actually, I would like to say I also predicted it wouldn't fall, to pat myself on the back as well. Jiyar, why did the protesters fail? Why didn't they manage to topple the regime, and how has the regime managed its chokehold on power?
I think it's not simple because the regime is a very religious, and they believe they get order from God, so they don't hesitate to shoot. Simple. And also on the side of opposition, not a strong leadership. I think, this is not my opinion, I really talked to so many of those young people who were in the street, who were willing to face those generals who were, they had a weapon to their teeth and shooting them. They were willing to die for their cause. They said, for example, when Georgetown, the opposition get together and split and fall apart, they said it really morally affected them. When there is an infighting within the opposition, it affects them. The fact is, I don't know, somebody told me if you take Mandela to Iran, he will become a dictator because we create dictator. So I think there is a lot of cultural works need to be done if you really want the regime go. And also there are a group of people with the regime who have the power, have the weapon, and have the money. They know they have nowhere to go. That's why they are willing to fight to the end. They know if they lose it, nobody knows.
One quick question for Jiyar, Negin, before we come to you. Jiyar, you've had an extraordinary conversation with a defector. Can you share that with us? Can you tell us who he was and what you think that tells us about the regime and how it's operating and how it's managed to hold on to power?
I think there are many people within the security forces, within the Revolutionary Guard. When we talk about Revolutionary Guard, the corruption, they have a money, it's just a really percentage on top. They have all those funds available to them. But Amin, who escaped Iran, he used to be a member of anti-riot and police special forces. They were particularly singled out because of their ability. They were looking for a lot of psychological quality in them who can be brutal. I mean, what he explained. But one thing he told me, many of those police forces, they are struggling just like other people. That's why he was telling me, so much corruption within the police system. He said they arrested drug dealer a couple of times, they release him, so if we release you, you can operate in this region as long as you give us a commission. Or when the commanders come and tell the police we are behind you no matter what, that's why police with impunity actually go out and shoot people. I think but also he said there is a lot of infighting within the police force. For example, some of the police, they don't like Basiji, those malicious loyal to supreme leader come to the street shooting people. There is a lot of infighting also within the security forces, and they were very tired during the protests. Maybe if it continued for a few more months, we would have some defection, but unfortunately we didn't see a lot of defection.
Negin.
So I'm going to disagree with some of what you said. For me, there's a difference between leadership and organizing. Although leadership is necessary for organizing, but it doesn't mean we need one leader. And a decentralized revolution needs a snowflake leadership, which means you have different hubs for leadership in different regions. And that's what we've seen, for example, in Kurdistan and Balochistan, is those kind of separate leadership, which makes it really difficult for the government to crack down. Organizing is something we didn't have. On the other side of it, what you're explaining about the cartels, for the drug cartels and all of that, it's the way the IRGC has been operating for years. It's been using the drug traffickers in a sense that going to the prisons and hiring them to do their bidding outside, even outside Iran. So we have an example of Najizin Nashti, who was like in prison in Turkey because he was this big drug cartel of the Turkey as well. So one of the things that IRGC managed to do, and basically IRGC is now the Iranian government, it's a decentralized packets of money and wealth that are going around the sanctions. So if any revolution would be successful in Iran, is to targeting those packets that are not necessarily part of the government, but is still all the money and resources are in their hands.
Sorry, I just wanted to say something.
It's kicking off here.
Yeah, that,
Yeah.
no. That Georgetown, I don't think it was one person. We had a Kurdish representative, we had people from different...
Yeah, it was top to down.
No,
Like,
exactly.
it wasn't
But what I'm
grassroots
saying,
organizing.
I'm talking, when I talk to people who left Iran, who were in the street, who they were willing to lose eyes and limb, they said when we saw them, they couldn't get along. It really morally affected us. That was my point. I didn't say
I agree with
one
you.
person leader. No, I don't think one person can lead a society with so many dimensions, religious-wise, cultural, so many different things.
Negin, there was a point last year where the regime looked weak and divided, and that's not just analysis from the outside looking in, but actually there was a leak of a memo that went out to top Revolutionary Guard brass that showed that it was weak and divided, and the Supreme Leader was unhappy with the response. So now, how has it come to this where the regime is suddenly looking so strong? How have they managed to so carefully and precisely crush these protests? How have they got here?
I think a really good foreign policy, getting close to the Saudi Arabia, managing to get right now. Today we had this news that US released billions of dollars to the Iranian in exchange for prisoner swap. And I think that has been a really big indicator in the protest, the regime continuing to gain its power, because there was a moment that they could have cracked down, but they managed to find sources of money. We shouldn't forget that one of the biggest challenges they have is actually paying their own soldiers. And the reason at that point Iran, the structure was wobbling, it was that they didn't have money to even pay these people who are going on the streets and beating other people. And unfortunately, the foreign countries, international community managed to send them some money, and they continue.
Azadeh, you've been following Iran's international relations, and Negin mentioned the re-establishment of diplomatic ties with its archenemy, Saudi, which was facilitated by China. We know that Iran and Russia are growing increasingly close, that Iran has been giving Russia drones. So how has this empowered Iran at home and in the region, and how is this playing into its hold on power?
I think that the direct answer to this question probably takes more expertise than I have, but what I would say is, to me, it shows the failure of the Western world, absolute failure of the Western world in fulfilling, lots of nice words that we all hear. I think, many of us, when we saw that news, it was more, because, I don't know about Negin or Jiyar, but I also consider myself, part of this, a member of this part of the world. And when I heard that and I saw that news, I thought, okay, Azadeh, as an Iranian American living in the UK, has failed to, play her role as not only a diaspora member, but also a member of the so-called free world, that, whether or not we like it, many of those young people in Iran who are risking their lives, they don't come to the street and they then think that they want a society as prosperous as the Chinese society. They actually think about central London and the freedom that we all enjoy here in terms of civil political rights, not only social and economic rights. And so I think it's just like what Jiyar said about the opposition. This was very demoralizing for those who I spoke with in the country, and in a way anger with those of us who call ourselves human rights advocates outside the country. What do? So you just go around and speak to the UN, and then what? So I think it shows a structural failure that we see over and over in many countries in at least our region. And clearly a sign of a more unified, international alliance in a way against, in my opinion, civic and political, the world that cares about civic and political rights and does not think that you can have first socio-economic prosperity and then maybe one day to have civic political rights, that thinks that all of these are interconnected. So that's how I see it really.
So I'm going to wrap this up soon because I want to give you the chance to ask questions. And my gosh, we've still got so much to go. There's still so many issues we haven't talked
memorize
about.
all your questions. I don't know.
You, Azadeh, are talking about the world's failure to act, and you're saying good words, and I know that you mean the UN has called it a human rights crisis and has demanded investigations, and surprise, surprises, the UN and nothing has happened. So what can the world do? What should the world be doing? And just to throw this in the mix, if you can wrap this up in a few minutes, you'll have solved the world's problems. We've got the nuclear crisis to talk about. So that has divided many people, because of course the nuclear crisis means lifting of sanctions, which could help Iran, but of course critics of the regime don't want that, because it would mean badly needed cash and investment to the regime, which would empower them. So I want to know to what extent you think the nuclear deal is important, and how you feel as Iranians, the issue that we're divided on about sanctions. And then I want you, Negin, to tell me what you think about prescribing the Revolutionary Guard. So prescription means designating them officially as a terrorist organisation, and there's a big call for that in this country. Go. Azadeh.
Well, again, I'm no expert on the nuclear deal, happily not an expert on this issue. But I would again say that whether or not this, engaging with Iran in order to deter Iran from becoming a nuclear power is the right direction, the way that the Western world went about it was, in my opinion, hugely problematic in sort of playing into the sort of pseudo-party politics of the Islamic Republic, making a benevolent image of someone like Javad Zarif, because he likes to have coffee with them and he's good at eating sandwiches and can speak good English, versus Khamenei, who is the supreme leader, and we don't talk to him, but look, we talk to the more modern and educated members of this hugely problematic and brutal regime, not only domestically but also regionally and arguably also internationally. So I think the way they went about it, and again, I'm not an expert in negotiations, but I think that really weakened a part of the Iranian civil society that had already tried to engage domestically with these so-called, better, quote unquote, less dangerous reformists, and by the time the nation was already had already tested this and had realized it's not going to go anywhere, the international community, mainly the West, decided that these are interesting and nice group of people to engage with. And when you would go to universities in the U.S., here in this country, they're still full of individuals who are whose families are hugely affiliated with not only the quote unquote less dangerous members of this regime, but also to IRGC and so on. Their field work's appreciated. They're perpetrators of mass violence in Iran, whose families are comfortably living here in this city, here in this country, in Canada, in many parts of the Western world. So to me, when the discussion about the deal sort of emerged many years ago, in the context of there was the war on terror sort of discussion and potentially a war in Iran, those of us who are peace-loving individuals, even though victims of human rights abuse in Iran, we kind of shyly welcomed it, just not sure whether it's a good idea, but maybe it would mean a little bit more freedom. But I think we were mistaken. We were absolutely mistaken, and I personally would find any kind of a deal with Iran, the Iranian regime at this point, a slap in the face of the Iranian women and youth and minorities and people who have been on the street.
Jiyar, what are your thoughts on sanctions?
Since I'm a journalist, I'm not in the business of suggestion and prediction. Just let me tell you about the West This is
Classic BBC journalist line.
this is a proven fact. The West, whenever there's an uprising in Iran, it was a growing movement, and now I think they are not after the interest of those people who have rise up. It is more about, okay, the regime is weak, we can get a point out of it. Obama did that exactly in the peak of the Green Movement in Iran. They dealt with Iran and went for a nuclear deal. And even right now, as we speak, you may think, okay, the Biden administration, or Europe as a whole, they might, have a harder line on Iran to say, okay, you are violating human rights, you're killing your own citizen, your own youth, you're blind. No, behind the scene, they made a deal to release, I mean, if some of you don't know, they released some of the prisoners, opposition, say, hostages. In return, the US agreed to some of the Iranian, billions of dollars of Iranian would be frozen, release them, and I think it's going to happen anytime soon. And as a matter of fact, last week we had one of the US diplomats somewhere, we were talking, she defended actually the US policy position, but I think it seems to me, since the beginning of the revolution, there are so many Western nationals have been kidnapped. And somehow they made a deal, they thought, okay, this is the last one. It looked like there's a cancer, they are trying to treat it with a painkiller. This is exactly what's happening. Iran, year after year, rounding up, arresting dual national and Western citizen, and then they get something out of it. And the reality is, I think that's what, if you sit down with the Iranian, those people who really trying to make a change in Iran, say we shouldn't rely on foreign countries. We should just rely on our own power. This is what I've feared lately. I think many people are very frustrated with the policies and double stand, okay, we're supporting you, rise up, and then behind the scene, oh yeah, billions of dollars being released to the Iranian government for releasing 3 or 4 hostages or prisoners.
I'm going to be really quick about IRGC. Before, I know some faces here, especially for the sake of my Mexican friends here, I'm going to give you some understanding of what IRGC is. I'm sure a lot of you know about it, but it's a revolutionary guard that has been established just after the revolution in Iran, and slowly over years, not only took over the army of the country, it also took over the economy, the film industry, the culture of the country, like every aspect of the country you touch it. It's either directly in the hand of IRGC, or indirectly run by the people who used to be IRGC, and under the disguise of privatization, they became, the owner of those industries in Iran. That put aside, IRGC has a wing that operates outside Iranian border, and it's called Quds Force. And the Quds Force, over the years, and I've done a lot of research on this, if anyone is interested, you can contact me after this. But they managed to have hands in different countries around the world, in drug cartels, collaborating with, buying from Mexican cartels, almost owning the mines and gold mines and a lot of land in Venezuela, making Venezuela as a part of their hub to do other operations in Latin America and changing process there. There was a presence of them in Bosnia in the late 1990s, beginning of 1990s, which was damped down by Germany. But all of these, the drug trafficking, the human trafficking that they're doing, the funding of the terrorists, as well as the funding of the criminal groups in the countries they're operating in. So for example, in the UK, and this is a fact now that the UK government is kind of shying away from publicly talking about it, that IRGC is hiring different criminal groups to do their bidding in the UK. It's not just about the money laundering anymore, it's not just about going around the sanctions, it's about targeting British Iranian citizens, it's about spying. You've heard the news of this prisoner who was ran away from the prison a couple of days ago, who was spying for Iran. There are so many different aspects of UK that is affected by the operation that IRGC does outside Iran. And it's not only the UK now. You've heard about Syria, you've heard about Yemen. The atrocities they do is unimaginable. For them, there's nothing more important than their own gains. And they're happy to sacrifice any other values that any human beings should have. So in this context, I, as a British Iranian citizen, I am really pissed off, sorry to say it in that way, that the government in the UK is not creating a way for people like me to be able to stop this atrocity on the UK soil. One of the reasons that they put forward is the complexity of legal work around it. But actually, if there is a will behind it, it's actually going to create a room, and I can argue that in details later on, that it will stop the hostage taking of not only the British citizens or British Iranian citizens, but hostage taking.
But how would prescription make any difference?
Because it allows us as the Iranians in diaspora, or as the victims of IRGC, to be able to go to the court and argue against them. And at the moment, we have no means of standing
because
against
they have
IRGC.
immunity as a state entity.
Yeah.
Right, I think we probably have time for 2 questions, so if anyone is absolutely dying to ask a question.
Here we go. Very quick.
It strikes me that you can't rely on anybody in the West to help. Within the large activist Iranian diaspora, is there not an argument for looking for a female leader to become a figurehead that everybody looks to?
Good question. Did everybody hear that? Did the microphone work?
Yeah.
Great.
Shall I go for an answer? I think there were a lot of conversations, especially the female leader who comes from inside Iran. And that conversation happened not just only after Jinnah's, even before Jinnah's death. There were a lot of conversations around that. Unfortunately, the Iranian government managed to kind of arrest all of them, put them in jail, the candidates that a lot of people had hoped for. But I think, personally, I do believe that it needs to come from the grassroots. We need to create new leaders, because this new generation of Iranians, the youth who are going on the streets, their needs and demands are much more progressive than my generation and the generation of my dad. They're asking, when we're talking about women-like freedom, we're talking about the rights of the most deprived part of the society. It includes LGBTQ+ community. The queer community has been really active in this movement. It includes the rights of the Baluchis, the Kurds, the Baha'is. The difference is, my generation and generation before me, we are, I'm not myself, but in general, we go around ideology. These people, they believe in values, equality, and that's a big difference. So that's why I believe that the leadership needs to come from them, and we need to cater them to grow and become prominent leaders.
Okay.
Thanks for the talk. I have to say I don't know a lot about the Iranian politics, but more at a high level, what's the current possible alternative to the current regime without foreign intervention with force, which we know always harms resistance and the actual people that should be removed. So I'm keen to hear.
Thank you.
I know he's working for BBC, you can't answer. How about you?
Quite honest with you. I mean, there's no answer to this. I mean, for many years, people were hoping the change come within the system. Just what happened in South Africa, exactly. They were willing in the peak of the power, sit down with the ANC and share power, and secure their own future, the future of their children, give up something in order to have a peaceful transition. But what we are seeing in Iran, particularly with the current supreme leader, quite honest, he hasn't backed off an inch, because I think he has the experience of the previous government, the Shah, the king. When he went back, he has to give up more. But also there are many people, actually, they said this is a sign of weakness, because they are so terrified. They're afraid if they give in a little bit, they have to give in more.
Anybody at the back? Because I feel like we're all right at the back. Here we go.
Thank you. Hi. There was so much talk about leadership and looking for leaders.
Isn't that a biggest weakness? Because leaders are easily imprisoned, removed, discredited, and tarnished. Why not develop tools instead of leaders? Develop tools for people to, organize, get in contact, and act and decide together without vulnerability of a leader, but give them a channel.
Let's have another question, and then you can answer all them up.
Hi, thanks for the great panel. Yeah, thank you very much. And I just want to add one little note to our former question. Negin, you mentioned leadership versus organizing, and I'm a journalist, I've been covering this story, and something that I've been hearing a lot from people inside Iran is the organic development of the revolution. So if who would say leadership versus organization versus organic connection, it's just like a network of sisterhood and brotherhood is developing through different layers of the communities and society, which started from Kurdistan, developed to other provincial, groups, and then Sistan and Baluchistan, and now it's ongoing. People call it revolution, maybe on the streets, and now revolutions of the minds. I would like to hear your ideas if you would like to use that term as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You have some tools.
I'm going to be quick about the organizing versus organic. I do believe the organizing needs to be organic. So the organic movement can take us to certain stage. We need to organize after that and realize, start building a society to replace the existing system. We need a system change. So that system change needed another system to replace it, otherwise it's going to lead to chaos. The way to do it is through the organic, solidarity, creating solidarity between people in a small, and that's why I use a snowflake model, because in a snowflake model you have leadership circles. So you don't have one leader. You have so many leaderships in so many different communities. It's really difficult to crack down, but it's a system building. So you build it from grassroots, you create leadership from that, and then you create a structure. When you look at any successful overthrow of the government in the past 150 years, there's a strategy behind it. There's an organization behind it. And we're not gonna get there on toppling of a government that is really, to the knee down into corruption and a lot of, international players and regional players who are aiding them because of the financial benefits they're gaining from Iran, to change the side, to come on the side of the people. So the people needs to build the system that would replace, and that's why I'm saying organizing. But I do agree with you that organic is the starting point.
I just wanted to add one point to what Negin said, that at some point during the uprising, I started to hear the word sort of a cultural political renaissance in Iran is taking place in the context of this uprising. And I tend to really agree with that. I think, and that going back to a question of what is so different from this, we can't take Iran back to September 12th, 2022 is because of this collective sort of unity and awakening and in a way a renaissance. So I think that for that you didn't need leadership per se, but I also think that you're talking about a more powerful of a regime that we would like to believe, and also in terms of their willingness to open fire, to use violence, and honestly, the world's willingness for them to stay. So for that, sustainability is an issue, and you need some kind of, organized collective resistance, which also comes with practice. Like Jiyar was saying, individuals in Kurdistan have had that practice of political parties. Many of us in many other cities haven't had that. And the tools, I wanted to say that Iranians are actually quite sort of savvy when it comes to things like, internet freedom, circumvention tools, the use of the arts as a way for political resistance, In a way, I think because Iran has been one of the worst violators of internet, and internet being one of the only means, I think we are doing relatively well when it comes to reliance on tools, and also on arts in particular as a form of organizing and collective sort of messaging, political communication.
Thank you so much for coming, everyone. That is the end of our panel discussion, and thank you to these amazing three panelists. As you know, and as you said, the Revolutionary Guard are operating in this country, so this
I'm
is
not part of the revolution.